This is Duke University.
Hello, welcome. Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Clark. I'm faculty here at the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship. Thrilled to welcome you to our final plenary session and to introduce Laura Callanan, who is a dear friend of mine. She is part of the social sector practice at McKinsey Company, and you have her bio in your packet. You will see as you look through that bio that she has tremendously varied experience in multiple sectors. She's worked in the private sector, helping to run a double bottom line investment fund. She's worked at nonprofits and foundations. She actually helped manage the endowment at the Rockefeller Foundation for many years, which is where we first met, probably at least 10 years ago now. And she's also worked in government as a senior advisor to the United Nations Development Program. I think if I had to summarize in 30 seconds or less what is special about Laura, I would say she is absolutely a disruptor of the status quo wherever she goes. She manages to, with kind of an inimitable low-key presence, demand extremely high performance from the people around her and push innovation at the same time. So she's really a model for a lot of us. She's also a member of our Case Advisory Council, and we're grateful for her wonderful strategic advice. Without further ado, I'm going to let Laura talk to you about surprise social entrepreneurs.
So, Kathy, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you guys for inviting me here today. And now that I've told Beth that I'm using the clicker, I can use the clicker. Okay, fantastic. So as Kathy said, I'm part of the global consulting firm McKinsey Company. I am part of our social sector office, which is where we serve foundations and nonprofits and public-private partnerships. Just a very quick commercial. We work in a few specific areas: education, global public health, economic development. We work on topics of climate and sustainability, and I'm part of something called our social innovation practice. So what do we mean by social innovation? When we set up our social innovation practice about a year ago, we figured we better have a definition for social innovation, and this is the definition that we came up with. And I would just like to emphasize three parts of this definition. So the first one is there's a real focus on listening to constituents, which I personally think I hold that as an important value. That means a lot to me in this work. The second thing I would emphasize is there's a focus on collaboration. So we believe that innovation can happen in the social sector at the intersection of the public, private, and social sectors, those actors coming together to shift paradigms, to disrupt the status quo, to do all those great things. And then the third thing that I'd emphasize about this definition is there's a focus on scaling. So oftentimes people equate innovation with something that's new and experimental and maybe not fully proven, but it's creative and it's fresh and that's great. And we would suggest that unless you can take that new, interesting, provocative idea and bring it to scale so it's really serving the people who need the help, then it's a nice experiment. Maybe you learn something from it you can apply next time, but innovation shouldn't mean that it's going to be a small niche undertaking. Innovation should happen at scale. What would be an example of something that we work on in our social innovation practice? Well, currently we're doing work on the social impact bond, which I hope a lot of you are familiar with. I know Kathy's working on a case on SIBs. And what we're doing, we're trying to do a landscape of the potential for SIBs in the United States. Look out for a paper coming from us in the next month or two that shares with you the results of our research and our thoughts on the topic. If you haven't run into social impact bonds before, they're really not financial investments. They are really more multi-stakeholder partnerships. They're all about scaling proven interventions in order to serve constituents better. So you can see how a social impact bond fits what we care about for social innovation. It puts constituents front and center. You can see there at the top of the diagram here. It is about collaboration since it's a multi-stakeholder partnership. And as I said, the purpose of a social impact bond is to scale proven interventions that work. Okay? So the topic today, I would say that SIBs definitely represent disruptive innovation. I think that they would be a great example of the topic for the conference, right? Disrupting the status quo. They're new, they're hot, everyone has an opinion about social impact bonds, they're trying to figure them out. Everyone wants a social impact bond, right? Best thing since sliced bread, all right. The conversation I'd like to have with you today is about whether we actually know and recognize social innovation when we see it. Or do we have some preconceived notions about what social innovation looks like, and do those notions limit us? Is that bad? And the way I'd like to set up this conversation is to share with you a story of someone I will call the surprise social entrepreneur. And this is a leader who's built a social purpose organization, which is now in its 20th year. And this is an organization that I would say focuses on constituents. It has scaled significantly, as you're about to hear. And the scaling is due in large part by its unique ability to collaborate. So since I'm here at Duke, I could do no better than to borrow from Professor Greg Dees what are the criteria for a social entrepreneur or social innovator. And here are the 5 criteria that he's laid out in some of his prior work. Just to say, going through the list, the first one's socially driven. Well, obviously that means that this innovator, this organization is committed to mission, not just financial results. Growth-oriented, able to take risk, thinking about different ways to reach scale. Innovative, seeing gaps and making opportunities, changing paradigms, shifting stakeholder behavior. 4, resourceful, collaborating across sectors, I think is a big part of that. Also leveraging innovative financing instruments. And then the 5th characteristic is accountable, using assessment and evidence to guide work, okay? So let's walk through these 5 characteristics in the story of our social entrepreneur, our surprise social entrepreneur. Once upon a time, our social entrepreneur, they're socially driven in that this is definitely a mission-driven business that's being operated. Access and equity are truly core values for this particular organization. The organization is very engaged with the local community and does not shy away from controversial issues. Our surprise social entrepreneur is also highly growth-oriented, and they have a track record to prove this. They've seen tremendous growth since 1991. Recently, they have significantly expanded their physical plant, and this is allowing them to produce much more product and serve many more customers than they had been able to do even last year. Because of the new expanded physical capacity, they are introducing some new product lines, and they're able to include now some wraparound value-added services that were not possible before. Also, they are starting to introduce technology in a creative way more into their work. Our social entrepreneur is innovative. I would say that when this organization started up, they had a truly, truly unique value proposition and jumped out as a clear first mover in their space. Now, over the last 20 years, other comparators have come to try to mimic or copy that value proposition, but I would say that this organization is still really leading the pack and quite distinctive compared to others who are trying to work in a similar way. This organization is annually, constantly adding new offerings. And now with this new facility that they've just opened, they have a dedicated incubator capacity inside the facility that they weren't able to manage previously. As I said, they have a true commitment to access and equity. That's a key value for them. And this has actually served them very well in terms of allowing them to be highly efficient and to actually generate demand that keeps them at practically a level of 100% utilization. Our social entrepreneur is resourceful. This new plant that I'm describing was financed through a very creative public-private partnership. They've raised capital recently to also support this plant significant round of capital and a lot of success in getting this done on the timeline they set out for themselves. They also have been building and expanding relationships with an eye to the future. So they've now undertaken a partnership that allows them to ensure that human capital and talent will never be a barrier for their growth. So they've built a relationship now that will ensure them a real talent pipeline. And lastly, our surprise social entrepreneur is accountable. They are very comfortable using feedback. They take in feedback almost on a daily, weekly basis. They are very comfortable making mid-course corrections if that's what's indicated. And they, to sort of tick the box, they also have met some other types of standards around accountability and transparency, and they have some recognition from GuideStar in that regard. So when I found myself thinking about this conversation today and this topic of our surprise social entrepreneur and this organization, I went through these 5 criteria, and I thought, look, this social entrepreneur absolutely fits the criteria. Maybe they're not who you would expect, but they seem to meet all of the requirements. But it occurred to me that a lot of people might not recognize this individual and their organization as a social innovator. And it's because I think we may have some preconceived notions about what a social innovator looks like. And I would say that for a lot of us, we think social innovators look like this. Or this. Or this is a social innovator, right? Here's another social innovator. Another social innovator that we know. For some people, this is a social innovator, right? But these are not the people that I'm talking to you about today. This is my social innovator. And I actually would be really quite surprised if anybody in the room recognizes who's up on the screen right now. So if you do, shock me and raise your hand. All right? So this is a guy named Jim Houghton, and he's the founding artistic director of Signature Theater Company in New York. And at this point, maybe I've lost some of you because you're thinking, this is ridiculous. What does somebody from the arts have to do with this? We're at the business school. How can a guy running an off-Broadway theater in New York, a nonprofit theater, possibly be in the same league as 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners, right? But think about it. We just went through the checklist. We spoke to each of the 5 characteristics that a social innovator is supposed to have. And Jim and Signature Theater seem to match up pretty well. So let me give you a little bit more information about this organization. So Signature is an off-Broadway theater with a very clear mission. For them, their mission is to honor and celebrate the playwright. From day one, they started with a unique value proposition. What they do is dedicate 1 year to the plays of a single playwright. So over a 12-month period, they will do 3, 4, 5 productions of a single playwright's play, which is basically the equivalent of a museum retrospective on a painter or a sculptor, but is not something that happened in the performing arts before Signature came along. They've been recognized by experts and peers. You can see the list of awards that they've won. And they do have diverse sources of revenue. 1/3 of their income is earned income. Now, that number would be higher, but because of their commitment to equity and access, they've made some very particular decisions about managing their financial house and their mission, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute when we discuss the Signature Ticket Initiative. Part of the reason they're on my mind now is about 2 weeks ago, they opened a brand new facility in Midtown Manhattan. It's a 70,000 square foot space. It includes 3 theaters. It was designed by the architect Frank Gehry. This gives them extraordinarily extended capacity to deliver on their mission. They successfully raised $70 million to finance this facility and the ongoing expanded programming that will happen here. And they did this through a really remarkable public-private partnership where New York City played a big role and the real estate developer, the related companies, played a big role. So basically, the related companies built a luxury apartment building on 42nd Street between 9th and 10th Avenues, and the Signature Theater is part of that space. I mentioned that they can expand their programming now that they've got 3 theaters and more space to work in, and they're able now to, there are 700 seats in the theater as opposed to the 99 seats when they first started. Expanding their programming, they're going to stick to their mission. They're going to continue to apply their unique value proposition of doing a retrospective on a single playwright's work through their master residency. But now, because they have 3 performance spaces, they can add some additional ways to implement on the mission. They're able to work with younger playwrights and nurture that talent through something called Residency 5. And they're able to bring back really playwrights from prior seasons in something called the Legacy Program. Signature's also developed a special relationship with the Juilliard School, and this is the way that they're nurturing the human capital and the talent pipeline for the future. So this is a place that young, new theater artists starting out can get some professional experience. And because of their location and the way they've designed the space, they're actually now a real asset for their Hell's Kitchen community. You can come into the space, you can sit and have a cup of coffee, you can use some of the museum-like high-tech displays that tell you about the history of the theater and the playwrights that have been performed there without ever buying a ticket. But the good news is, if you wanted to buy a ticket, you could probably afford one, because Signature's put in place something called the Ticket Initiative. This has been going on for a number of years, and it's really fantastic. I would just acknowledge that for a lot of people, the arts are not considered to be social. We talk about the social sector and social impact, and people don't think the arts rate because the arts are seen as expensive and elite, and unless you have a couple of $100 to buy a pair of tickets and go out for dinner and pay for parking, you're not going to go to the theater. Because of the commitment to equity and access, Signature has really revolutionized this. They have used their nonprofit status to seek donations, and they use those donations not to pay Jim a big salary, but to subsidize the cost of the ticket. So for the next 20 years, every ticket for every performance at Signature Theater will be $25. And that brings the cost of a theater ticket pretty close to the cost of a movie ticket in New York. As a result, people who've never been to the theater, they have a chance to go, and they have a chance to go regularly. The audiences are much more diverse as a result, not surprisingly. And this is a pretty conscious choice that they made. So if you thought that 30% earned income was low and didn't really qualify this organization as a real social enterprise, the reason it's lower than it could be is because they've made this choice to keep the ticket prices accessible for everybody. It's part of their social purpose. So just going back to our 5 characteristics, here you've got uncamouflaged some of the points that I made earlier when I didn't want you to know it was a theater company, right? And I'll just point out 3 things on this slide. So number 1, around being socially driven, obviously an arts organization is in a unique position to advocate on important issues. And this organization has produced work that focuses on topics like HIV and AIDS and apartheid. In terms of being growth-focused, just the first year, 1991, when Signature started, the budget was $35,000. And this year, the budget will be $11 million. So to me, that's very real growth, no matter what kind of organization you are. And then lastly, for number 5, for being accountable, I've done a lot of work with a colleague who's here, Jonathan Law, on social impact assessment. And so we all get very fixated on metrics and KPIs and feedback loops and learning cultures and all this sort of stuff. And I'm a fan of all these things. But in some ways, like any retail experience, there's nothing more real than a live performance and the feedback that you get right there across the footlights, right? You tell the joke, nobody laughs, probably you're going to do it differently the next night, right? And a culture like this that's all about rewrites and rehearsals and other ways of making changes to the work, it epitomizes what feedback loops and learning cultures are really all about. So because the title is The Surprise Social Entrepreneur, I should tell you a little bit about Jim. Who is he? He's a pretty mild, rather unassuming, entirely sincere guy. He doesn't necessarily fit the rock star profile of some other social entrepreneurs we know and love. I'm not sure that his CV would ever attract attention from a Skoll or an Echoing Green or an Ashoka. When he started Signature, he was an out-of-work actor, right? He was waiting tables. He used $16,000, his life savings, to start this new theater company, to follow his mission and vision about what this organization could do. Like any good social entrepreneur or entrepreneur of any kind, he used up his savings, he's begged money from family, he maxed out all of his credit cards, all of this sort of stuff that makes it hard on the individual to pursue a mission like this. One thing that I'd observe is, unlike most for-profit entrepreneurs and probably a lot of social entrepreneurs, Jim has always been about rising the sector and building the capacity of the arts to focus on the originating artist. Part of this is, in the early days, to make ends meet, he would have his sort of September to April gig with Signature, and then would take on a summer theater program of different kinds. So he would wear two hats during the course of a 12-month year. But I would say that openness to be part of other organizations that shared a similar mission really built a series of relationships for him in the sector and set a tone of collaboration from the very beginning that I would credit as being behind the amazing ability now to do these public-private partnerships so successfully. So that's the end of our story about the surprise social entrepreneur. And I hope you didn't mind the parlor trick of this too much. But to me, it's really a question of our being able to challenge our assumptions a bit. So what do we need to do? Should we disrupt our own assumptions of what social innovation looks like as part of our goal of disrupting the status quo? And this is the question that I'm hoping we can have some dialogue around together in the time that we have remaining. I'm wondering if, as a sector, we've fallen into some preconceived ideas of what social innovation is, what a social innovator looks like, and then what it's not. And I would posit that if we have fallen into these limited expectations, that they're probably holding us back. Do we think that social innovation only occurs in certain program areas, for example, not in the arts? Do we think that social innovation is connected to something that's new, so it's got to be around new technology or new markets, right? Theater goes back thousands of years to the Greeks. This is not something that inherently is new. I was in the education breakout just a few minutes ago, and someone was saying, the nature of education fundamentally hasn't shifted for decades and decades. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you innovate around the margins of some of this stuff. And I guess in terms of the individual, do you need to have an MBA to be a social entrepreneur? Can you have an MFA, a Master's in Fine Arts, instead? Or what if you don't have any sort of graduate degree? Or what if you don't have any sort of formal education? I mean, do we have limited expectations about what a social entrepreneur looks like? So that's the end of the prepared remarks. I'd love to open this up for not so much questions and answers, because I'm not suggesting I have the answers, but maybe for comments and reactions. I would suggest that in order to disrupt innovation, we have to disrupt our assumptions about what innovation is and who can be an innovator. And I'd love to know what you think about that, and maybe we can all have a little bit of a discussion about it for a few minutes. So, Beth, I think you've got some microphones if people want to share some ideas, and I will just try to act as a facilitator to the discussion if that's okay with all of you. And I'll cold call people I know, so someone's better raise their hand or we're going to have a very dull end of the discussion. Okay, I think we have somebody in red.
My name is Laura Group. I just wanted to thank you for making the connection of social innovation with the theater, because I believe really, truly, in theater you have to be very creative, especially with the finances. And I wanted to link that to the Cirque du Soleil. I was in Montreal, and you can see how they build up that all these clowns in the streets, and now what we have done. But at the same time, it keeps Cirque du Soleil renovating because the finance, many people go to the theater, so they had to change it, and they have now connections with other things. I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
I really
have a-
will. I know so few people
No,
that if you know me, you're going to get cold called in a minute. So Beth, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So I think it's really interesting that because I was actually expecting you to go through. I did not look at her slides before, so didn't know who it was. But I was expecting it to go on the other side and for it to be a tech company or a large business that we have all heard of that you could also call a social.
That I was going to say Walmart was a social entrepreneur.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly. So then my comment on that is kind of what is the spectrum and how important is definition and how important is labeling someone as a social innovator and you could probably make that argument for a Walmart or an Apple or some of these companies that are big for-profit institutions but are creating access to education or information. So I would love to hear others' thoughts on that. Is kind of how broad is the spectrum, and how important is definition for this, especially as it's a kind of nascent field that is trying to get momentum.
So thank you for the speech. I just kind of have a question and I want to share. So do we know kind of like how big those untraditional surprise social entrepreneurship market is like? And what kind of like infrastructure or resources they can tap into, because it's not like a traditional, you can go to a health or like education kind of like grants. So how do they if I wanted to actually start a social entrepreneur business around this kind of surprise kind of realm, like where would I go? And how do people actually go right now?
Well, so I'll just try to respond a little bit to that, but other people might have thoughts from other sectors or from personal experience. I mean, there's a whole nonprofit route that the arts take in the United States, right? They can get some government grants, they can get grants from foundations, they get donations from individuals, they usually have some sort of ticket admission or concessions or some earned revenue part of their stream. Increasingly, arts organizations are thinking of ways to fulfill their mission and extend their reach beyond their doors. So people are looking, for example, the Metropolitan Opera, you're probably familiar, right? They now will stream live operas to movie theaters, but you get an opera experience because you can't get to New York, but you can go and pay a little extra money and see a Saturday afternoon showing of an opera that's happening in Manhattan. So there are ways that people do this traditionally in the nonprofit field, but I would say that the arts, particularly theater, for a long time has crossed over between nonprofit and for-profit. You now have examples where for-profit producers try out, basically incubate new work in the nonprofit part of the theater world. And that's happening in New York, like new musicals. It's less expensive, it's less risky to try it out inside a nonprofit theater that has a subscription audience. And so while this might sound very narrow, none of you were going to go into the arts, and so it's like, well, how does this apply to me? It just does suggest that there can be some compatibility between the nonprofit end of the spectrum and the for-profit end of the spectrum that can be mutually reinforcing and helpful to folks, whether you consider yourselves more squarely at one end, the other end, or if you'd like to flexibly be able to work and shift in the middle space. So.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was very interesting. A couple of comments. The first thing is market failure. So I guess part of the our prejudices about social entrepreneurship and social innovation overall is about focusing on areas where the market is not going to do it. So what about health? What about education? And the second point that I think is important in terms of our preconceptions is who are you focusing on? Are you focusing on the middle class, well-off, worse-off? I mean, we are society, everyone is society. Right. But there's a value in terms of who you're focusing on and the marginal improvement that you're making to the lives of others.
So just a quick reaction is that lack of access, lack of equitable access, to me, I'm going to assert that that's a market failure. So in this humble example about the theater, I mean, really, it's $100, $150 to go to see high-quality theater in New York. I'm just going to stick with this example, right? And so now for $20 or $25, you can go see the best playwrights in America, first-class productions, and get access to it. So if market failure if lack of access, lack of equitable access is an example of market failure, I would say that this is an example where this social entrepreneur saw the problem and went into to address it.
Hi, Laura. So I really appreciate you widening the definition. I think this is more of a comment, just the fear of having the definition be too wide and then attracting people to this field who see themselves as doing something for their region and their community, but not really looking at different parts of the marketplace and different users of their social innovation. And so widening it almost to have, it kind of reminds me of like the organic label and everything being labeled as fair trade when no one really knows. So I know we have an obsession of labeling things and having definitions in this space, but I only worry that if we widen it too much, it offers those to come in to sort of be part of this trend of a movement, but not really understand.
So this sounds like it relates to Beth's question about, what's the definition and do we need definitions and how do definitions serve us or not? I would wonder if Ashoka might respond to your comment by saying, but everybody should and could and should be a change maker. And if the definitions leave people out or discourage people from fulfilling their potential in their communities, how could that possibly serve us? So I know that we use definitions, it's a school, right? We try to talk to each other, we try to agree on concepts, we try to have a debate and exchange amongst each other, and that terminology is one of the tools that help us to do this. But in terms of, I know this is not exactly what you were suggesting, but the notion of keeping somebody out, I'm not sure why we would want to keep anybody out of social innovation.
On sort of that topic and on the topic of access that he was talking about before, I think there's this sort of interesting separation between content and delivery, especially when it comes to media or technology and social innovation. So in your theater example, most of what might be considered socially innovative is the fact that it's being delivered and made accessible to a lot of people.
Right.
It happens to be as well that the content in this case is maybe social as well, dealing with HIV/AIDS or apartheid or whatever the case may be. Where do you see that separation in the sense of, let's say something social and socially innovative because it's delivering content to a lot of people, but that content may be, stupid cat videos or whatever the case may be. I mean, what are the requirements for something's content to be social, versus maybe just the delivery of it, if that distinction makes sense?
I think that's an interesting question. So if you're suggesting everyone should have equal ability to waste time watching silly videos on, their digital device, that might not be the way I spend my time, right? But far be it from me to say that's not something other people should do. I mean, I think that this comes in, again, to this question of what is social innovation. And I like the distinction between the content piece and the delivery piece. Obviously, when we think about scaling, we think about operating models that help you to scale. We think about both the process and the product can be innovative and contribute to making it easier or harder to scale. So innovation can come in a lot of forms. I would think it could be exciting and interesting to study how those different forms play out in different parts of the sector and then see what cross-pollination is possible.
Does this work? Is it on? Is it on? Okay, that's right. Great, thanks. I'd just like to comment on two things that really struck me about the story, and maybe you can comment more about it. The first thing is the sustainability aspect, because having worked from a nonprofit, it's great when you have a social innovation idea, but I really wonder how this guy managed to last for 20 years, scale it up, and despite so many competitive forces, I know the theater scene was hard hit by the economic recession, and how he managed to change his model and make sure that he has a sustainable revenue stream that will allow this expansion. And the second interesting aspect is the issue of human capital, because I find social innovators to be very charismatic or have really great leadership skills. And what happens with the leadership pipeline? What happens after Jim leaves the organization? Is there someone to take it over? And I think these are long-standing issues for social enterprises to answer in the long term.
So the sustainability question, I think, is a good one, and I don't know if there's been research done about the path that organizations take to survive and grow, but I'd be curious if there are patterns to that path that people have observed. I mean, in this case, I would really credit that a lot of this is a sincere, good guy who people like to deal with. He's not a pushover, right? But people trust him and are willing to stretch to support him and the mission of what he's doing. The choice to expand beyond just the artistic mission to add this value of access and equity into what Signature does, I think was a huge step for them. So you may have seen in the New York Times, there was coverage over the last couple of weeks as this new space was opening. And Bill Ackman, who's a hedge fund manager for Pershing Square, gave $25 million to Signature. And he was quoted in the New York Times as saying, "I've never been to a Signature theater production. I've never seen a play at Signature, but I find the idea of making theater accessible to people so compelling that I'm willing to write this great big check and support this part of their mission." So I would find that an encouragement to stick to your mission, even when in the short term it might seem that diverging from your mission could allow for cash flow and other growth opportunities, money when you really need it in a difficult way. I think the question about leadership is very important. I know it's something that Signature has been thinking about and managing for some time. While Jim has been in place throughout the whole 20 years, there have been 3 or 4 different managing directors, so his number 2 within the organization. And I think the ability that baton has been passed successfully has been helpful. I think that the intentional relationship with a place like Juilliard to nurture this talent pipeline expresses the fact that this organization is focused on succession and continuity within the field and thus within its own organization. I'd also say that the board has grown and evolved in a very natural and good way over the years, and so there are many more, sort of wealthy, influential leaders on the board than when I was on the board, which is probably 15 years ago, right? So, but all good questions.
I think that one part of this conversation that I'm interested in sort of seeing come into it is the hierarchy of need states. And I think that that's a really integral piece of this field is providing theater opportunities for low-income minority folks in New York is great. But within that hierarchy, I would posit that it falls below providing bottom-of-the-pyramid people, sort of basic livelihoods, that sort of thing. And that there's a space within the field for reaching folks at all different levels of that need state. I think Dan Epstein from Unreasonable Institute told a great story about a former McKinsey analyst who went and started a social enterprise, and he loved his job at McKinsey, and he found it very, very, very challenging and all of that. But for him, meaning was about solving one of the world's greatest, most pressing social issues. And again, I think it's narrowing it down and looking at sort of the hierarchy of needs in our society, and then choosing those that are most prescient and most fundamentally important to us in terms of solving. That's something that I would sort of want to factor into the definition of social entrepreneurship and social innovation.
So I'm not going to have a debate about where arts fits in the hierarchy of needs. An artist friend of mine made a comment. When I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, there was an arts and culture program, there was a health program, there was an economic development program, there was a food security program. And one of our colleagues in food security was very dismissive that the foundation was spending money on arts and culture. I mentioned this to an artist friend who said, "Yep, but I bet he wants someone to sing at his funeral," right? So the arts play a role for all of us in our lives. The reason I brought up this example was not because I was saying, listen, the arts, they're better than health and education, and it's the notion that I think we limit ourselves to where we think we can find models, examples, inspirations, and new ideas and energy about how to do our work. So if you want to work in the health field, I think that's fantastic, but I would just prompt you, I'd push you to look beyond health or agriculture or some of the other things that we all naturally seem to subscribe to as being social and the focus of social innovation, and think disruptively about where else you might be able to find ideas, tips, cautions, motivations. Borrow from other sectors, regions, actors. Yeah.
We have time for 1 or 2 more comments. Go ahead.
Hi, first, thanks so much for shedding light on the surprise social entrepreneur And I think, this is why Ruby Learner's Creative Capital is so important in providing financial and advisory support to artists. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on if you think that might be why the MFAs are sort of falling behind the curve, is because they have these great ideas and don't necessarily, have the skills or resources or know where to turn to kind of turn that into an idea.
So Creative Capital, if people aren't familiar with it, is a terrific organization. It's out of New York. It's run by someone who's a native of Lenora, North Carolina. And it is, I would say, the brainchild of the Andy Warhol Foundation and a old-time venture capitalist from USVP, right? So at the time when the tech boom was happening and all these VC funds were doing so well, there was this notion of if you invest in artists today, and something they do hits, right? They do a movie. They write Harry Potter, right? You've given the artist a grant today to go on retreat and write a book, and they write Harry Potter. Some of the profit from Harry Potter should come back into this pool of money to fund other artists. The idea that just like a VC fund, there'll be some things that don't make any money, there'll be some things that break even, and there'll be some things that hit big, and the big hits will sort of sustain the rest of the portfolio. To the point that was raised, the other thing that Creative Capital has done is realize that artists are entrepreneurs, even if they don't acknowledge that for themselves, and they're sort of a single shop startup, and they need to be better at marketing themselves. They need to be better at managing their budgets and finances. They need to be more thoughtful about setting a long-term strategy of where they want to get to. And so Creative Capital provides the sort of consulting and support for artists to help them be sort of a fully integrated startup in and of themselves, right? They bring the talent and the creativity and the innovation to it, and there are other skills that they need to be fully functional. I think it's just another interesting example to say, in the same way that people say, well, look, the microfinance funded social entrepreneur has to be so much more creative and resourceful because they're working without MBAs from Duke, right? They're working with less resources. They're working in more difficult and competitive environments. I think it's the same sort of thing. Here you have people who have been scrappy, who have worked on a shoestring, who have been creative about how to keep going in their work. And just to say, I think that there may be some things that other social innovators, especially those who want to be disruptive, could learn from their friends in the arts. So I think, was that our last? One more question.
So I'm going to end maybe with a controversial question. And my question is, I don't know if it was Bill Clinton or someone else who said recently that, we're living in this great time where we actually don't need so much more innovation. We kind of have a lot of ideas to solve problems. And so, how much more social innovation do we really need, and how much more do we just need to grow out the innovations, the good innovations that we already have?
I think that's a great question. And to the extent that following up on the point that was made earlier, that innovation comes in many forms. So maybe we have enough innovation on content, and maybe we need more innovation on the delivery and the implementation piece of the puzzle. That could be a great point. I mean, although at the moment I'm a strategy consultant, I think I'm hugely a believer that implementation is where it's at, and that you can have all the great ideas and new widgets in the world, but if you're not able to deliver on that, it's not going to matter. That's why, as I described earlier, our definition of social innovation is not just this nice little idea that in a little niche that never gets to scale or is never fully utilized. If the idea is innovative but can't go anywhere from there, then I would take it off the list. That wouldn't meet a true definition of innovation for me. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate the questions and the comments, and I hope that this gave you a little something to think about after today.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.